Once Germany's defeat became inevitable during World War II, the thin threads that held the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to snap as both fractions contemplated the ominous future ahead. The situation was especially tense for the former American prisoners of war in the Stalag Luft I camp near the town of Barth, Germany. They were now free men, but they were stranded on the Eastern Front at the mercy of the Red Army. Making the long trip to the Western Front was not an option, as Eastern Europe was still ravaged by war and pockets of committed German soldiers. However, staying with the Soviets was no guarantee of safety either, as the American soldiers feared they could be taken to Siberia and used for forced labor, or worse. When the US commanders learned of the former POWs' plight in Germany, they swiftly orchestrated a massive and risky rescue plan, one where they would strip down hundreds of B-17s to their bare bones to become lighter and fit more people. Also, the reliable flying fortresses would need to make the unprecedented long trip from France to Barth without refueling, a challenge that also required careful planning. Soon, the largest airborne rescue mission of World War II was about to begin. Free but stranded. On April 29, 1945, the Red Army loomed ever closer to the Stalag Luft I prisoner camp, and the Nazi commander in charge ordered the mostly American prisoners to prepare to evacuate. For fighter ace Colonel Hub Zemke, the highest-ranking American officer in the camp, this was his only chance to break free. Thus, he defied the order and told the German commander that no American soldier would leave under their conditions. Knowing the Soviets would arrive at any moment, the German soldiers complied and let the Americans go. Some wanted to leave the camp as soon as possible, while others, including Zemke, believed they needed to hold in place until they received further orders. The Soviets arrived the following day and quickly ransacked the town of Barth while celebrating their victory. The Americans were treated with cautious respect, but the steep language barrier and the sheer brutality of the Red Army troops created plenty of tension. Such brutal behavior disturbed the Americans, and many began to wonder what their fate would be in the hands of the Soviet army, and if it was worth staying put. Tensions rise. The Americans didn't have much choice, as the Soviets took control of the camp soon after arriving and replaced the German guards. The Soviets then proceeded to lock the gates, restricting the Allies' ability to wander freely. The Soviet leaders claimed that they needed to be cautious until they could identify the American and British citizens and then wait for an acceptable way to send them home. For the Allied soldiers, it didn't matter. They were prisoners again. Outside the camp, an ideological struggle was being fought as Joseph Stalin advocated for Eastern European nations like Poland to reinstitute themselves under a socialist government, while the US, Britain, and the rest of the Allies were pushing for free democratic elections. To pressure the West, Stalin purposely slowed down the Allies' repatriation processes while publicly pretending nothing was wrong. The Americans then heard rumors that the Soviets were planning to repatriate them through the Russian Black Sea port of Odessa instead of France, which meant traveling through Russia. To make matters worse, the situation inside Stalag Luft I was becoming unbearable as the Soviets assumed a more hostile attitude by the day. Colonel Zemke was then able to send his British counterpart, RAF Group Captain Weir, to intersect with Field Marshal Montgomery and plead for a mission to unite the POWs with their countrymen. Montgomery reportedly met with Soviet Commander Marshal Rogossovsky to discuss the situation and negotiated an agreement to evacuate the Allies by air as soon as possible. Other accounts allege that after 2 weeks of being locked up, a livid US colonel visited the camp and threatened to shoot the Soviet commander if he didn't free the men. According to the report, the Soviet officer complied and allowed an air evacuation. As the tensions reached their tipping point, Winston Churchill personally wrote to Stalin to address the state of affairs. The Soviet leader then responded by saying that the British prisoners were being treated better than Soviet POWs in British hands. For Britain and the US, one thing was clear. They needed to get their over 9,000 men out of there before the situation escalated further. The plan. The scheme for the evacuation had to be prepared swiftly. It was an extremely long distance, and the aircraft would have to fly over battling and contended territory with no opportunity to refuel. The aircraft would fly singly, avoiding formations or groups, while staying at 10,000 feet or below, so they wouldn't need oxygen and save the maximum fuel. Over 110 large cargo aircraft were assigned to the mission, most of which were B-17 Flying Fortresses. The airlifters had all their equipment and armament removed to fit as many rescued allies as possible. And to keep the weight low and carry as many POWs as possible, the conventional 10-man crew would be reduced to a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a radio man, and a flight engineer. In addition, the bomb bays were covered with plywood, making room for 25 to 30 additional men, and all the passenger seats were removed, leaving just the pilot and co-pilot seats and an ample rectangular space for the men to cram together. One of the pilots recalled the peculiar setup, quote, "If you can imagine a transport without any seats except for the pilot and co-pilot, that's what we were flying to rescue these POW airmen." The plan was to take American POWs to the US Camp Lucky Strike in France, and the British airmen to air bases in southern England. Time to help. It had been 4 days since the Allied powers had officially accepted Germany's unconditional surrender, and the airmen of the 91st Bombardment Group were eager to return to the United States after the excruciating bombing campaign in the war's final days. When they were suddenly called in for a meeting, everyone expected instructions to return home. Airman Raymond W. Darling remembers that moment, quote, "When we assembled in the orderly room, we were told by the briefing officer that we had one more mission to fulfill. Our mission would be to fly into northeastern Germany to rescue our POW airmen from Stalag Luft I. To the commander's surprise, the airmen were ecstatic to help. The airmen were told to fly fast and low and to leave their engines on the entire time. They would need to save every drop of fuel to accomplish their ambitious task. The commander then ended the meeting by saying, quote, "The Russians don't seem to want to cooperate in releasing our American airmen POWs, so we're going in and getting them. If the Russians don't like what we're doing, then it's just tough shit." Darling later recalled that it was the first time he ever heard applause at a briefing. Many of the pilots conducting the operation considered it the most memorable and significant mission of their careers. The opportunity to save their comrades while flying over Germany unopposed was a refreshing change from the frantic bombing missions they had recently fulfilled. Meanwhile, in Barth, the POWs had learned of their imminent rescue, but some were still uncertain if it would actually happen. Still, the men worked tirelessly to prepare the nearby airfield to receive the hundreds of planes that would soon land on the runway. Work teams then cleared the path of mines and obstacles, just in time for the arrival of an advance team carrying General Bill Gross, commander of the 1st Combat Wing, the man in charge of the operation. That team built a makeshift radio tower using a generator and the B-17 radio equipment, a contraption that would prove vital during the next 3 days to orchestrate the eventual landings and takeoffs. Rescue Operation. The first B-17s arrived in Barth on May 12th and evacuated the first load of POWs, mainly injured men needing specialized medical attention, as well as the groups of British airmen. The bulk of the American servicemen began to board the planes the following day. For many, it was the end of a long and painful chapter in their lives. Some were overjoyed when they saw the bomber planes waiting for them. One of the ex-POWs was a member of the 91st Bombardment Group, and he remembered the moment he saw his own units rescuing them. Quote, "I will never forget the thrill and joy of marching out of Stalag Luft I to the airfield at Barth and seeing the 91st BG aircraft waiting to take us home." After weeks of uncertainty and fear, Operation Revival proved a massive success, with no significant incidents reported. For both airmen and POWs, the flight home felt like a breath of fresh air as they peacefully cruised over the silent but gruesome scenes of war-torn Europe. Navigator George Jacobs would later say of flying over former so-called flak alleys and flak valleys, quote, "I consider it one of the most memorable days of my life." By May 14, 1945, Operation Revival had successfully rescued 1,500 British and 4,000 US troops in what is considered the largest airborne evacuation of World War II. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed the story, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. And for more fascinating history-inspired content, check out our other Dark Documentaries channels, where we publish new content all the time. Stay tuned.